make this a brief introduction. You didn't come here to hear me. But I will say first that I'm hoping that this will be the first of a number of foreign affairs programs here at the Grua Center. I know there are a lot of people here in the community who are very interested in foreign affairs. And I think it's particularly important right now when we hear a lot of political candidates providing what I might call misleading information and coming up with recommendations that border on the absurdity. But in any case, some of you may recall the last time I introduced a speaker, it was an Iraqi friend who spoke of a non-exactly untroubled country and region. The subject this time is Ukraine, which, as we all know, has also a few difficulties. I'm particularly pleased to announce, to introduce Wayne Merry, who is a friend of I don't know how many years. More than I have fingers and toes to count. He is retired from the Foreign Service, had a distinguished career in the Foreign Service, including a number of tours in difficult places like Moscow and Athens. He is currently a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. He has published a great deal and speaks frequently on topics relating to Russia, Ukraine, Central Asia, European security issues, transatlantic relations. Perhaps most noteworthy, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that Wayne is not one of those to subscribe to what we might call groupthink, not one to drink the Kool-Aid, as it were, which, as I think many of you can appreciate, is something that's not infrequently done in Washington. His views are not calculated to please those who might provide him with favors or benefits of one sort or another. He is an original thinker, and I think that will be a great benefit to all of us here. Without anything more, introduce Wayne Merry.
Thank you, Stuart. Good evening, and happy to see people come out. I understand there are a number of competing events this evening, and it's commendable that people do show an interest in a subject that is in some ways obscure, but nonetheless quite important, like Ukraine. I think for much of the commentariat in the United States 2 years ago, most of them couldn't have found the Donbass or even Crimea on a map. But with the Russian annexation of Crimea and support for separatist forces in eastern Ukraine, Crimea sort of became topical and fashionable. But often I think not so much because people really cared very much about Ukraine, but because they saw it as an aspect of a resurgent Russia, part of the mentality of the new Cold War. Now, I've been going to Ukraine fairly consistently since 1981. I was, in fact, supposed to open a new American consulate in Kiev in 1980, but Jimmy Carter decided, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, not to do so. But I've got a lot of Ukrainian mud on my shoes, and I always hesitate to make simplistic or broad generalizations about this place. It's a very large, it's a very complex country, a very diverse country. And I caution you to be too accepting of anything you hear about it, even from me. Because I just came back from 9 days in Ukraine of intense conversations and heard lots and lots of different points of view from lots of people from different perspectives in Ukraine. And I want to try to convey some of that complexity to you. Now, the Ukraine that you see there on your maps does reflect a country, a nation, Ukraine, which has its own language. Ukrainian is not a dialect of Russian, it's an honest-to-God Eastern Slavic language. Ukraine is a nation with real history and real traditions and real culture. But the lines on the map of what you would call Ukraine have moved around enormously. Partly because in this part of the world, everything is pretty much flat. There are almost no mountains. And instead of the rivers defining the borders of Ukraine, the rivers tend to go right down straight to the middle of Ukraine. So what constitutes Ukraine at any point in history in the last 1,000 years has changed enormously. It's frequently been part of a Russian empire. It's sometimes been part of a Polish empire, occasionally been independent. But the borders that you see there on the map today that emerged at the end of the Soviet Union are kind of a contemporary historical result of the events of the last 100 years. And in the last 100 years, Ukraine is a country and people that have suffered colossal social trauma. From 2 world wars, from Hitler, and from Stalin. 100 years ago, some of the heaviest fighting in the First World War was taking place in Western Ukraine, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German empires were fighting the Russian Empire. In the 1930s, collectivization in the great Black Earth regions of central Ukraine led to the deaths of millions of people. Forced industrialization in the area of the Great Basin of the Don River, which is now referred to as the Donbass, led to the movement into that area of enormous numbers of people, millions of people who had no previous identity there, were mostly Russian speakers, and the creation of a large number of industrial cities that were Russian speaking, with agricultural hinterlands were essentially Ukrainian speaking. At the end of the Second World War, Stalin pushed the borders of the Soviet Union far, far farther west than they had ever been under Imperial Russia, forcing out populations that had lived there time out of mind, Polish, Hungarian, Slovak, other populations. Of course, the Jews had all been annihilated by the Germans. And shifting into that, populations of people from other parts of Ukraine or from Russia. I mentioned some of this to give you a sense that in the demographics of this country that exists today called Ukraine is a result of an enormous amount of trauma, of killing, of suffering, of war. Not just of wars between countries, but wars among peoples. For example, in the 1940s, there was huge bloodshed between and among the Poles and Ukrainians in what is now Western Ukraine, but had historically been Poland. And what you see in many of parts of Ukraine are populations that don't have a lot of tradition where they live. Now that doesn't mean that Ukraine is not a country with very, very deep traditions. It does have. But it has populations whose identity with someplace called Ukraine is often very weak. I was recently talking to a civil society activist from this part of the country, and she just very candidly admitted that almost all of the people who lived there had never had an identity with a place called Ukraine because they or their parents had been moved there after the Second World War for post-war industrial reconstruction, and they came from all over the Soviet Union, and their identities were Soviet or local. And then with the breakup of the Soviet Union, suddenly they were now part of this new entity called Ukraine. And one of the things that I remember very vividly, I was working in Moscow at the time when the Soviet Union broke apart, that when Ukraine became independent at the end of the Soviet Union, some of the more clear-eyed and forceful Ukrainian nationalists who tended to come from Western Ukraine actually argued about slicing off that eastern part of the country and giving it to Russia. This is the area that is currently the scene of the fighting today. A quarter of a century ago, Ukrainian nationalists thought very seriously about getting rid of it, giving it to Russia. Now, they didn't do that because the eastern part of the country is where most of the heavy industry is. And it's 1/6 of the country produces 40% of the GDP, and you don't give that up. But the idea that some of these Ukrainian nationalists had was to try to shift kind of the geo-demographic and geopolitical center of gravity of the new Ukraine farther to the west. Because what happened when Ukraine became independent is it is not just geographically the widest country in Europe. It's the widest country in the European political culture. And it's not just a matter of West versus East. You're going to read an enormous number of news articles about West versus East in Ukraine. It's much, much more complex than that. There are are very strong identities in this part of southern Ukraine around Odessa, very, very strong identities in this part of northeastern Ukraine around the huge industrial city of Kharkiv. Often areas in which identities are very different, urban and rural. In my recent trip, I went to a fall harvest festival outside of Kharkiv, where the local population there were completely different, often in even the way they spoke, the language, than in central Kharkiv, which is a major industrial city. So I mention that to give you a sense that superficial generalizations about this country are always wrong. It's a country that is the product today of a century of some of the most enormous violence that has been experienced anywhere in the world. Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands, is fundamentally about the violence that took place under Soviet rule, under Hitler during the war, in what is today Ukraine. The fact that there is still the result of this massive social trauma there today is hardly surprising. It would be surprising if there would not. Now, the new Ukrainian state, at the end of 1991, inherited some of the greatest assets of the Soviet system. In many respects, of the 12 non-Baltic countries that emerged from the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was the one that had the most on offer. It has it has one-sixth of all of the black earth agricultural region on Earth, which makes it a big agricultural exporter. It inherited large amounts of heavy industry based on deep shaft coal mining. It inherited a lot of the Soviet Union's most advanced universities, design institutes, scientific institutes, and technological industries. For example, the first atomic laboratory in the Soviet Union, lab number 1, is in Kharkiv. Lab number 2 is in Moscow. The first nuclear accelerator in Europe was in Ukraine. When Ukraine became independent, it had a lot going for it. Fully literate workforce, and those things that the Soviet Union did well. Public health, primary and secondary education, infrastructure. Ukraine was a country that should have had a very bright future. When Ukraine became independent, it had living standards roughly on the same level as Poland. Today, Poland is 4 times as high in living standards as Ukraine. Ukraine's living standards are 1/2 those of neighboring Belarus. And friends, if you're not doing as well as Belarus, you really are not doing very well. So what happened? The difference between Poland and Ukraine was that Poland had a different political culture that had developed over the preceding quarter of a century with the development of the Solidarity movement. What Ukraine inherited was one of the most corrupt of all of the post-Soviet ruling elites, worse than the Russian by a long chalk. Ukraine has been ruled by a series of economic oligarchs and political forces whose corruption it would take me I'd have to keep here until midnight just to describe. But let me give you just one instance. Former Prime Minister of the country, Mr. Pavel Lazarenko, after he was Prime Minister of the country and had a number of other important jobs, he was sentenced to 9 years in the United States federal penitentiary system for large-scale money laundering, corruption, extortion, and so forth. And after he got out of the slammer in California, he's been fighting extradition back to his own country where he's wanted for the United Nations had tabulated him as having stolen at least $200 million. And he's also wanted in connection with a number of homicides. He's Prime Minister of the country. And if I may say, a dramatic example, but not an exaggeration of the nature of the ruling political elites of that country. Now, Ukrainians are not stupid. Whatever image you have of Ukraine, it's not just endless black earth steppe, though it does have endless black earth steppe. Ukraine is mostly an urban society. It's an educated society. It's a society in which people in the last quarter of a century have had access to media and news. And a dozen years ago, this actually began to come to a head in 2004. A thing that was called the Orange Revolution, which was a popular reaction to a stolen presidential election, which people gathered on the main square of Kiev, which is called the Maidan, and basically said, we won't accept this stolen election, and they actually were able to reverse it. And this brought in what many people in Ukraine believed was a fundamental change of direction for the country. And we in America were told, I remember very vividly, this is the new Ukraine, we're going to break the power of the oligarchs, we're really going to move against corruption, we're going to take a fundamentally Western orientation, you're going to see this is going to be a fundamentally different Ukraine. And it was the same old, same old. In some cases, even worse. Now, I'm not saying that the new government didn't do anything right. It did a number of things right in terms of beginning to re-examine the painful pages of Ukraine's national history. But what it also did was to inflame tensions between Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking parts of the population. And it essentially let the economy go to hell in a handcart. So that living standards, which were moving smartly ahead in places like Poland, continued to deteriorate in a country that is intrinsically really quite rich. And this led to the events of 2 years ago, what's often now called the second Maidan Revolution. The Orange Revolution of 10 years ago now we refer to as the first Maidan Revolution, and this is the second Maidan Revolution. In which, again, people went out onto the streets in a very large way in response to a government which at that time was about as close to being a pure mafia state as you could imagine. What I've been hearing in my 8-9 days in Ukraine was essentially the same thing that I had heard a decade ago, which is this is the new Ukraine, we're really going to break the power of the oligarchs, we're really going to move against corruption, we're really going to have a Western orientation, this is a fundamental change in direction. The people who told me that, and this included a number of government ministers, senior people in the presidency, people in the national parliament, I believe that they all were sincerely telling me what they believed to be the truth. But there is a recent, very extensive polling of Ukrainian national opinion. It was done by an American organization, IFES, which came out about a week ago, which demonstrates that the people of the country don't believe it. They think the country is going in fundamentally the wrong direction. That basic question, do you think your country is going fundamentally in the right direction or the wrong direction? 3-1, Ukrainians say the wrong direction. This is partly because people, 2 years into the second Maidan revolution, are becoming frustrated and angry and skeptical that this is the same old again. And it's partly because living standards have been taking a severe hit. According to the IMF, the Ukrainian economy is going to decline by 11% this year. Much of that is the result of the war that's going on in the eastern part of the country. That has removed a large part of the coal and steel industry from the national economy and from national exports. And of course, wars are very, very expensive. But let me get to the question of where this war came from. Now, for almost a quarter of a century, independent Ukraine basically very consciously faced in two directions. It maintained very extensive political and economic and human relations with Russia, which is not so surprising since almost everybody in the eastern and central parts of Ukraine have immediate relatives who live on the other side of the border. And Russian is the first language, sometimes the only language of many people in much of Ukraine. So in fact, in most Ukrainian cities, people speak Russian and Ukrainian interchangeably. I mean, it's not, in many parts of Ukraine, this is not really a big deal. But what they were also doing was developing ties with the West, particularly Europe, with the European Union. And Ukraine was conducting kind of a Janus-like policy of working both sides. And this actually was very much to Ukraine's benefit. to essentially work both an Eastern and a Western orientation at the same time. Unfortunately, neither Moscow nor Brussels could well left alone. Moscow, which essentially exercised primacy in Kiev and had extraordinary influence and even control through many of the oligarchs, through many parts of the ruling elite, on Ukrainian policy, decided that it wanted to orient Ukraine more towards a Russian-centered new Eurasian Union, which would be a union of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Armenia, which Moscow was seeking to construct in part because of the rise of China to the east, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism to the south, and because of the exclusion of Russia from both European and transatlantic security and economic systems. At the same time, the European Union initiated what it called an Eastern Partnership Program, which in the case of Ukraine was very heavily directed to essentially taking Ukraine away from Russia and incorporating Ukraine into a European Union-led system without any promise or expectation that Ukraine would ever actually be allowed to be a member. Now, you can have an association agreement with the European Union for a long time and never become a member. Turkey's had an association agreement with the European Union since 1974, and it has no prospect of ever becoming a member. That was basically the same kind of thing that was being offered to Ukraine, much of which would carry with it significant benefits for Ukraine, but it was definitely offered as a zero-sum. We win, Russia loses. And it was presented in a way in which Ukraine would have had to give up very, very substantial preferential economic and other trading relationships with Russia in order to gain a series of preferential trading relationships with the European Union. It was definitely zero-sum. The refusal of the president at that time, Viktor Yanukovych, who frankly was a knuckle-dragging gangster, to sign this agreement led many people, young people in particular in Ukraine, to feel that he was rejecting Europe, which I don't think is true. He was quite willing to be paid off by both sides. He just didn't want to change something. But the image that the government was rejecting Europe really did bring out an enormous amount of popular uprising, not just in Kiev, but on the central squares of a lot of cities, the Maidans of other parts of Ukraine, which led to the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. In response to which, Moscow misinterpreted, I think, what was happening. They saw this as essentially a Western organized, American-sponsored color revolution to overthrow a man who they actually didn't like that much. I mean, Vladimir Putin and Viktor Yanukovych couldn't stand each other. But somebody who they at least felt was someone they could do business with. I like to sort of compare Nouri al-Maliki in Baghdad and his relationship with Washington with Viktor Yanukovych in Kiev and his relationships with Moscow. Sometimes you sort of have to deal with people you just as not, but nonetheless. But the Russian reaction was violent. It was self-defeating, and it has created a huge crisis, which was the annexation of Crimea, and then the support of insurgent forces in the Donbass. Now, it's worth saying a word about Crimea. Crimea has a history that is pretty much separate and of its own. I mean, I could make a good historical argument that Crimea ought to belong to Turkey. But the one thing that historically never did belong to was the Ukrainian state. And the demographics of modern Crimea are overwhelmingly Russian. And I don't think that there was much question that given the choice between staying with Ukraine and joining Russia, that in a genuine and free and fair referendum, the majority of people would have voted to go with Russia. Now, supporting separatism in the Donbass is a very different matter indeed. There you have a much greater mixture of populations. You are now, I mean, Crimea in some ways almost is an island, and it has kind of the mentality of an island. It does think of itself as being different from the mainland, and has for a long time. But the Donbass is not. I mean, the Donbass has historically been as much integrated with Ukraine as with Russia. And in fact, in many respects, the border between Ukraine and Russia there is extremely artificial in terms of people's history, their families, where they trade, where they shop. But supporting a military insurgency in that area was clearly a complete violation of the rules by Russia. I think they were expecting it to be much more successful than it was. It wasn't. The Ukrainian military, although vitiated by corruption, did rally enough that it was able to at least hold its own in the field to prevent any expansion of that area of insurgency farther down toward creating a land bridge between Russia and Crimea. Now, I had a chance to speak with a number of veterans of that fighting, and I think it is worth pointing out that much of the fighting that was going on there last year was extremely violent. Certainly the heaviest fighting to take place anywhere in Europe since the Yugoslav wars. And in terms of armored warfare, more intense than even in any of the wars in Yugoslavia. This was very heavy and very brutal fighting. And what it is left is essentially today a ceasefire, which is satisfactory to nobody, which has created 2 million migrants from that area into other parts of Ukraine, which is to say 2 million people who used to live there are now living in Kharkiv and Kiev and other parts of Ukraine. 16 universities were moved, an enormous amount of disruption in people's lives. And there's something close to another 1 million refugees from that area living in Russia. This is a huge disturbance of a very, very important part of Ukraine's economy. It's coal and steel, and a very large numbers of people. This is now, in terms of dealing with this, we are now in a situation where a Ukrainian government that has been very fairly elected, but lacks control of its own national parliament, which is not that unusual in a parliamentary system, is trying to deal with a series of problems all at the same time. One, it's trying to maintain the country's sovereignty. It's trying to deal with the fact that it has lost Crimea and that it's got an ongoing war in the eastern part of the country. Now, candidly, almost every Ukrainian I have spoken to privately says, forget Crimea, let it go. It's not worth worrying about. But the Donbass is a very different matter indeed. That's regarded as the national domain, part of the national territory, and that is worth fighting for. And letting that go in a formal sense, I think, is something that almost nobody in Ukraine wants even to contemplate. But even the veterans I spoke to, who were most confident that they could hold off any future attacks from Russian-supported separatists, say that they know that they couldn't defeat actual Russian army formations that would be again engaged in conflict. At the same time, the government is trying to deal with this 25 years of misrule, trying to deal with the inbred corruption, the continuing power of the oligarchs, the deterioration of the economy, decline in many areas of life. I mean, one thing that you may have seen in the newspapers is an outbreak in southwestern Ukraine of polio. Now, this is really quite shocking because polio is easily preventable. And the reason there's been this outbreak in polio is that for a number of years, and I was told this very candidly by very, very authoritative sources in Kiev, many of the officials who were supposed to be dealing with childhood inoculations and vaccinations have been on the take from pharmaceutical companies. And so the vaccination rate for polio for children under the age of 5 is less than 50%. This is in a European country. And the Canadians have recently offered free polio vaccine to take care of this problem, of this outbreak. and the government's still not doing anything about it. I mean, I mention that as kind of a dramatic instance. I mean, for crying out loud, most of us in this room can just barely remember what polio was. I mean, to have an outbreak of polio in a European country is just barbaric. And particularly to have it happen because people are on the take is just criminal. And I give you that as just one dramatic example of the kinds of things that the senior political leadership in Kiev is struggling with in public health, in education, in infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Now, a country of huge contrasts. I mean, if you take the high-speed railway between Kharkiv and Kiev, which I did, you're on a new South Korean piece of equipment that you just wish a metro line or half as good. But if you go to the railway station in Poltava, I mean, you could shoot a Soviet-era movie there and not have to change anything. I mean, it hadn't changed a bit. If you go on the main streets of big cities like Kiev or Kharkiv, I mean, the nightlife, the cafes, the restaurant, the Wi-Fi, all of this is entirely European standard. But you visit some people in housing settlements, in old communal apartments, you're in third world conditions. My colleagues and I went to the leading burn hospital in Kiev, which treats, among other things, veterans of the fighting who have burn wounds. And the staff are obviously very dedicated, working very hard, in a hospital that wouldn't bear comparison to my father's hospital in small-town Oklahoma in the 1950s. You're just struggling with primitive equipment in an appalling piece of infrastructure, trying to deal with burn wounds. So, I mean, this is a country that it's very, very hard for me, even having been going there for a third of a century, and having recently been there for 9 days, to generalize about. A country very much in very hazardous conditions, is a country at war. If you walk down the main streets of cities, you'd scarcely know that. Young men walking around with their girlfriends, very, very happily not in uniform. You almost never see a uniform in the city. On the other hand, what you do see are reactions against this sense that the political system is once again just in the hands of the corrupt and the oligarchs, and that everything we fought for in the second Maidan revolution is being betrayed as we were betrayed in the first Maidan revolution. What the expectations of people in Ukraine are heavily focused on is Europe and America. What Ukrainians, most Ukrainians, many Ukrainians at least, hope for is a European identity. They want, many of them delude themselves that they can become part of the European Union in the near future. It's not going to happen. The European Union is up to here with other problems. The last thing they want is more. On the other hand, the European Union is very concerned the resumption of active fighting in the East could lead to another wave of migrants. And with all the migrants they're getting from the Syrian war and from Africa, the last thing in the world they want is a wave of migrants coming from Ukraine. So the European Union is seriously interested in trying to help Ukraine. But I have to tell you, as somebody who used to deal with Ukrainian military in my Pentagon years, that there is this thing in both Europe and in Washington called Ukraine fatigue. If you've ever dealt with Ukrainian bureaucracy, if you ever dealt with Ukrainian government, you're so cynical about what crooks they were. I mean, I dealt in my Pentagon days with all 12 of the post-Soviet militaries, and the one that stole from us the most by a huge margin was the Ukraine. So everybody's a little cynical about dealing with Ukraine. But the European Commission and the International Monetary Fund and some parts of the U.S. government are seriously doing things to try to help things in education reform, in policing, in various kinds of law enforcement, and in helping the Ukrainian military to a very limited extent. And the two principal European governments, the Germans and the French, are leading the diplomacy that works with the Ukrainians and with the Russians on trying to bring about some kind of a negotiated settlement to this problem in eastern Ukraine. A negotiated settlement which would probably have to lead to a great deal more decentralization of authority. Ukraine, since independence, has been a very highly centralized state with very, very little regional autonomy or authority. And anything that would lead to a peaceful settlement of this conflict would have to involve a good deal of decentralization, at least for the Donbass region. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of bloodshed. People have died, people have been forced to migrate. A lot of goodwill has been lost. It's easier to break crockery than it is to remake it. And trying to create some kind of a viable, long-term, peaceful settlement of this problem in eastern Ukraine is not going to be easy. The Germans and the French, I think, are doing about as good as can be done. But the question for many people in Ukraine, having understood that they should be living at least as well as people do in Poland, and that what's wrong with Ukraine is his own leaderships, makes them quite cynical. I mean, I said in a recent article that up until the outbreak of the war in the Donbass, you could say that Ukraine was its own worst enemy. But now you can't say that anymore. Russian policy, European Union policy have made Ukraine into a proxy battlefield. In some respects, a political battlefield, an economic battlefield, but in the Donbass, a literal battlefield. And that competition for dominance and influence between Brussels and Moscow, between Washington and Moscow, in my view, is tragic for Ukraine, and is certainly not what Ukraine needs. And Ukraine definitely deserves better than what it's had the last 25 years. So, with that note, I would invite your comments, questions, arguments. Ms. Mann.
Could you comment on any possible effect between Russia's now having sent soldiers into Syria and their commitment to helping to maintain the Assad regime, what effect it's having in the Donbass?
Yeah, I know a lot of people think that those two things are related. In fact, very senior people in Kiev see them as related, and their view is that the current ceasefire in the Donbass was so that the Russians could then send forces to Syria. I don't buy that at all. First place, the kind of forces that the Russians are sending to Syria are not the kind that they're using there at all. The Russians don't use any aviation in this conflict in eastern Ukraine. The only air power being used there is Ukrainian, not Russian. Because the Russians maintain the fiction that they are not involved in that conflict, that they are only providing support to the separatist forces, and separatist forces are themselves doing the fighting. Now, the separatist forces are getting their tanks and artillery and everything else, and there have certainly been times when actual Russian military formations have participated in the fighting. Whenever the fighting is going badly for the separatists, Russian actual armored formations would intervene to guarantee that the separatists would lose. But the kinds of military assets that the Russians are currently engaging in Syria are ones that have nothing to do with the nature of their involvement here. And the kinds of things they're doing here, I have to say, I think are well within the capacities of the Russian military. A colleague of mine who is a real expert on Russian military inventory says that they've got 34,000 main battle tanks that are not part of the Russian military force structure. They're just sitting in warehouses that they're using to feed in to their surrogates in the Donbass. So I see those as two different policies. I mean, the notion that Syria and the Donbass are either or is, I think, is a tempting conclusion for people to draw who think that this means that somehow now Russian policy in one area or the other is weak. That going into Syria makes Russia weak on dealing with Donbass. I don't buy it.
Would you make some comments about the Dutch report on the downing of the Malaysian airliner?
Right. I remember vividly a year ago summer when word came through of the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner. I was having lunch with a very senior French diplomat, and he said that he thought that that was really going to be a watershed for European thinking about the Ukraine conflict. And he was absolutely right. And what made it a watershed was not, in some ways, the loss of the aircraft, but the brutal insensitivity with which the separatists treated the crash scene and the bodies and the luggage, just it was really horrific insensitivity. And that event really did engage European publics and European politicians in Ukraine conflict in ways that they had previously never done. Now, my own view is that while the evidence is not definitive, I think it's absolutely conclusive that the aircraft was shot down by separatist forces in the Donbass using a Russian-provided Buk anti-aircraft system, because they had been using similar systems to shoot down Ukrainian military aircraft, Antonovs mostly, operating at from 18 to 24,000 feet. Now, the passenger airliners were all flying at 35,000 feet. And these airlines rather foolishly assumed that because they were flying at that high altitude that they were flying essentially above the battle zone. But the guys who were operating that anti-aircraft missile system were looking in their radar, and they had been shooting down Ukrainian military aircraft. In fact, since the conflict began, Ukraine has lost over 40% of its military aircraft. And they see something up in the sky there, and they push a button, and they shoot it down. I don't think anybody deliberately, intentionally, willfully shot down a passenger airline. But to give that kind of military capability to people who are unsupervised in a battle zone in which there are civilian airliners flying overhead is wildly irresponsible. And I think ultimately you have to ask, does some of the responsibility adhere to those who provided the weaponry and didn't exercise control over how the weaponry was used? I would also note, the point that I made earlier, that the only military aviation that's operated over eastern Ukraine has been Ukrainian, not Russian. The notion that the Ukrainian ground forces shot down the plane would lead you to ask, what were they shooting at? The only planes that were there of a military character were their own. Why would Ukrainian forces shoot down a plane when there were no Russian aircraft operating in that battle zone? Doesn't make any sense. So to me, the question of culpability is it's not definitive, but it's pretty open and shut. Sir, and then this gentleman. Sure.
Is this crisis without religious implications?
Religion, Ukraine has the advantage of being pretty much all Orthodox Christian, but within that there are significant divisions. There are three major divisions of hierarchical authority within Orthodox Christianity within Ukraine. And then in Western Ukraine, there's what's called Union Church, which is people, this goes back to the 16th century. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's kind of become a hobby of mine. People who exercise Eastern religious rite, essentially Byzantine rite, but who are loyal to Rome. So you have essentially three different types of formal Orthodox Christianity, and one Orthodox rite loyal to Rome, all operating in the same country. For the most part, that's not really what the conflict is about. In fact, it works the other way around. The conflict has tended to exacerbate tensions between and among those different religious factions. But it's not really a dispute really between them. I would note one point, though, is that the Western Ukraine, which is the center of Union Christianity, is the source for most of the Ukrainian diasporas in the United States and in Canada. those which are the two largest Ukrainian diasporas outside of the region. So we in North America tend to get a view on the conflict that is kind of filtered through the prism of people from that part of Ukraine. We almost never hear from the people in that part of the Ukraine. But the simple answer to your question is, well, religious life in Ukraine is complex, and by the way, very much alive. Very, very, very much alive. That's not what the conflict is about. Which I suppose is a piece of good news. Gentlemen?
Ukraine has suffered so much for so long. I mean, that's where all the nationalities on the east swept across for 1,000 years to the west. And I looked and I thought, well, it's almost the size of Texas. But what you're telling us is there's virtually no place to hide because the migrations have swept all the way up in the corners.
Yeah. Well, this is an area that one historian referred to as the great conveyor belt of history, where you had peoples coming out of Mongolia, Manchuria, parts of Central Asia, sweeping across. Sometimes they swept down into the Caucasus, and then, some of them ended up, that's where the Hungarians came from, that's where the Finns came from, people ended up in, Bulgarians came from. The fact that the only mountains anywhere in Ukraine are the Carpathians. And traditionally, the Carpathians were sort of where the Austro-Hungarian Empire ended and, the Russian Empire started. The Carpathians are kind of where Turkish power and Austro-Hungarian power and Russian power and German power all kind of, that mountain range kind of defined their dividing line. Well, that wasn't good enough for Stalin. I mean, Stalin put the border well on the western side, because much of this territory here was historically Hungarian, Slovak, Polish, Romanian, Ruthenian, all kinds of things. But between that and that, it's basically, it's sort of like the American Midwest. I mean, it is really flat as a pancake. And the only thing that differentiates the land, pretty much, are the great rivers. And the rivers here overwhelmingly go north to south, emptying down into the Black Sea. So deciding where borders are and even where identities are, this is a very flexible part of, in most of Western Europe, you have much more compact countries whose borders are defined by clear geography, the sea, the rivers, the mountains, something. Ukraine and Belarus, to the north of it, are ones where particularly the eastern and western borders have moved around a great deal. Ukraine, when it emerged from the breakup of the Soviet Union, had the farthest western border that any Ukrainian state had ever had, and the farthest eastern border that any Ukrainian state had ever had. And a big problem that exists there now is trying to solidify identity. The war in the Donbass has done more in 2 years to create a sense of Ukrainian unity and identity and solidarity and oneness than in the previous 20 years. The question is how deep does that go? And that I can't answer. But certainly the reaction to Russian policy has been to strengthen Ukrainian identity, particularly among young people, in ways that you never saw in Ukraine in the preceding quarter of a century. But a question is sort of, where's that going to be 3 or 5 years now? Because a lot of people in Ukraine are attaching a lot of expectations and demands and hopes on Europe and to a lesser extent on America. If those expectations are not fulfilled, then what do they do? Where do they go?
That's a question that is what's in my mind. We were in Poland a year ago, and we were in Warsaw, in Prague.
Yep.
And speaking with the locals, and one of the questions was, how are you feeling about what's going on the other border of Ukraine? And they were very worried. Is there a concern that if this doesn't get resolved in a way that keeps Ukraine unified, if Russia has more of the eastern flank, that concern that people in Poland had, are they going to keep coming further west? How do you see that?
Well, I see that to some degree as a bit hysterical. I mean, Russia is not that powerful and strong a country. But what I do see as a real concern is that this Ukrainian state, which is extraordinarily wide and extraordinarily diverse, if it again fails to meet expectations, if the second Maidan revolution leads a few years to a third, this could lead to a fragmentation of Ukraine somewhere else. I mean, for example, at the time of the Maidan revolution, the first part of the country that threatened to secede was not these guys, it was those guys. They were threatening, saying, if Kiev doesn't do what we want, we're out of here. So this notion of fundamental adherence and loyalty to the Ukrainian state of any particular region was certainly not very strong in Crimea. It's of mixed loyalty there, but even in Western Ukraine, you get a sense that we're loyal to Ukraine so long as it's the Ukraine that we want it to be. I think the next 3, 5, 7 years could lead to internal strains in Ukraine that could fragment it in other ways. Certainly people in this part of Ukraine feel a very strong sense of identity in Poland. There's a lot of people who talk about a federation that would go from the Baltic to the Black Sea. You usually hear that from Poles who see that the capital of that federation would be in Warsaw. People in Romania are not quite so enthusiastic about that idea. People in Hungary are not quite so enthusiastic about that idea. But this notion that there is a sort of a common East Central European identity is one for which there is in a number of these countries, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, a certain degree, in Moldova, a certain degree of adherence. But how far east does that go here? How far, one of the things that the Russians wanted is to have a Eurasian economic union. To have scale and depth, they wanted it to include Ukraine. But there are a lot of people in Moscow say, well, we could just do without this part just as well. But if you're talking about an East Central European confederation sometime, could it really go as far east as the Donbass? That's, in terms of political culture, that's a lot. So I think I would just say that I think there are a lot of dangers about the integrity of Ukraine in years ahead that are internal and have to do with the identity of the place and sense of loyalty. And so we're getting 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, and 3. Yes.
The piece of land that,
Sir.
the piece of land that Yalta's at the bottom, almost an island. I understood that Russia moved into that area and established naval bases on that land, which is the Ukraine. Is that?
Well, historically, Crimea really never has been part of a Ukrainian state. It was attached to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic by Khrushchev in 1954. The naval bases that have been there were there from the time of Catherine the Great. And in fact, you just don't have to take a word for almost all every Russian I know, and I've known a lot of Russians, I've lived in Russia for 6 years, think that Crimea is Russian. And part of that has to do with the 2 great sieges of Sevastopol in the Crimean War and in the Second World War that are Valley Forge and Gettysburg and the Bataan Death March rolled together for Russians, and I'm not kidding. Now, the bases that the Russians had here in the last 25 years were there by treaty rights. I mean, Russia had by treaty rights up to 25,000 troops in Crimea. It used those, but the population of the country, of Crimea, was only about 5% Ukrainian. So when Moscow decided to move to detach Crimea from its titular relationship with Ukraine and annex it, it was a bloodless coup. I mean, it was, to put it mildly, a violation of a whole bunch of treaties and international commitments, international law, and a variety of other things like that. But it was not a difficult thing to do because the loyalty of people here to this system there was always pretty thin. I think the gentleman over here.
You take the western end of Ukraine, which I believe you said had the industrial and manufacturing.
No, that's the eastern end. The eastern.
I'm sorry.
Eastern, yeah.
Well, what is the ownership of that productive? I assume a good bit of the GDP of Ukraine is contained in that area.
It's oligarchic. The Ukrainian economy is overwhelmingly dominated by a few dozen obscenely rich people who essentially stole it.
Well,
Just like
which way do their taxes flow?
taxes.
They don't pay any taxes.
Oligarchs run this country. The country doesn't run the oligarchs. And the problem is that, for example, some of the richest oligarchs who have substantial economic ownership and dominance here have a foot on both sides. I mean, they have a foot on the Russian side and a foot on the Ukrainian side. And one of the things that's very clear is that much of the oligarchic domination of Ukraine is driven not by a sense of loyalty to the country, but a sense of a loyalty essentially to the corporation. And a lot of those have significant economic investments in Russia. Many of them have significant economic investments in other places too. I mean, Cyprus basically exists to launder money from Ukraine more than it ever does even from Russia. But in terms of ownership, it's oligarchic, and it's in the hands of a bunch of robber barons, some of whom have actually done relatively intelligent things with some of the factories and some of the equipment and other things. I mean, I'm not saying there hasn't been improvement. I mean, for example, railway travel in Ukraine is 9 days better than it was 20 years ago. But, for example, Ukraine still has, according to the International Energy Agency, it is the most energy inefficient country on earth, which is the amount of energy it takes to produce a unit of GDP is the highest for any country in the world is in Ukraine. That's to some degree an inheritance of Soviet wastefulness, but they've had a quarter century to do something about it, and most of the oligarchs have not. I think there's a lady here.
Would you hazard a guess as to the future of Ukraine, and specifically what does Putin want, and will he be doing some diplomatic trading with what's going on in Syria?
Well, I've got 3 articles, longish articles, one coming out in the book from Columbia University Press, one coming out in a conference in Rome, and then another coming out from my own organization, which I try to speculate on these things. The only thing I will predict about the future of Ukraine is it's going to be difficult. And that Ukraine fatigue is a very foolish policy guide for people in European capitals or in Washington, because Ukraine is not going away. Ukraine as a problem is not just going to solve itself if others ignore it. Putin's own goals, I think, are essentially, first and foremost, that Ukraine should not come within the European, NATO, or American orbit. Ukraine is the birthplace of the Russian nation itself. Very few Russians think of Ukraine as a foreign nation or a foreign state. They tend to condescend to the Ukrainians shamelessly, like the Czechs did to the Slovaks and the Swedes did to the Norwegians. But it's not often, I think, so much neo-imperialism as it is condescension. But the one thing that I think Russian policy is driven by is an overwhelming sense that a Ukrainian state that becomes part of NATO or is totally controlled by the European Union is under American dominance is a fundamental threat to the vital national interest of Russia. It would be the same as if a government were to come to power in Mexico City and decide to make a series of trade and other deals with China and become a military ally of China and invite Chinese military forces to deploy to Mexico. I mean, anybody here think that any government in Washington would not sort of do whatever was necessary to prevent that happening? Well, that's essentially the reaction in Moscow. Clumsy, incredibly clumsy, incredibly disrespectful of the fundamental need for the Ukrainian state to be able to maintain at least the appearance of its own sovereignty. But I think that Russian policy sees itself, notice the way I phrase it, Russian policy sees itself on Ukraine as being reactive and defensive and conservative, not as being expansionist. But that's sort of, but if you happen to be a soldier who is on the firing line protecting Ukrainian soil from the advance of Russian separatists, I can tell you, having spoken to some of them, you see it rather differently.
I don't know how much more time these programs usually last for, just about exactly an hour. But let me just pose one other question, if I might. I know there's a Nova report that there's been a certain amount of Chinese investment in Ukraine. And I think that, I'm not sure what you know of that.
Well, there's been a certain amount of Chinese investment just about every place in the solar system. And that includes in Ukraine. One of the things they're doing in Ukraine is something they're doing in a number of countries, which is they're taking long-term leases on agricultural land. They've noticed that some of the best agricultural farmland on earth is in Ukraine, and the Chinese are coming in and doing long-term leases on huge amounts of that land so that they can use it for agricultural purposes. This is something they're doing in a number of other countries. They're doing it in eastern Russia. But the fact that they're doing it in Ukraine is hardly surprising. They are also buying up some Ukrainian export-oriented industries. But much of what Ukraine exports of a manufacturing character competes with what Chinese export. It's iron and steel, and that competes directly with what the Chinese themselves export. But yeah, are the Chinese putting some money into Ukraine? Yeah. But show me some place where the Chinese are not putting some money.
Thank you, everyone.